All right. And we are live. I'm going to just check one moment, make sure we're live on Instagram. Usually it takes a minute, so I'll check back again. But hi, everyone. Good to see you. Excited as always. It's always such a good time. And for those who don't know me, I'm Dr. Punke Afolabi Brown, the founder of Restful Sleep MD and the Restful Sleep Place. And really, our mission is one thing: to help individuals, including children and their families, change their relationship with sleep. And guys, I have a friend here, like legit. She's a friend. I'm just all over her page on Instagram, learning all the things about kids with neurodiverse conditions. And so today we're going to be talking about a very, very important topic. And that is really helping kids with neurodiverse conditions, specifically autism, thrive. And I think this is just so important because a lot of families are struggling. And of course, it impacts sleep in so many ways. So good to have you here today, Dr. Tay. Can you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So, I'm Dr. Taylor Day, or I go by Dr. Tay on social media, my podcast, but I am a licensed child psychologist. I specialize in working with autistic children and their families and really helping families to navigate this from a neurodiversity affirming lens, and also then thinking about the whole family around the autistic child, because I think that's often something that we don't have a lot of conversation about. And when the whole family can be supported, it in turn supports the autistic child, but then also supports you, as a parent. You're a human too in all of this. So I love being able just to kind of do care differently and being able to provide a lot of free education about autism, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about autism and how to navigate it, and also parents feeling a lot of pressure around all the things that they are told sometimes that they should do that might not always be the best fit for their family.
Yes, all of that, all of the above. So before we jumped on, I had meant we were just talking about the fact that you're like so relatable, like you're so down to earth. Your content on social media, especially on Instagram, it's like people are like, oh my gosh, she gets it. Like, how did you come to be that way? And how do you feel that helps you with getting that message out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's twofold. I think
Mm.
first and foremost of I grew up with an autistic brother. He's 10 years younger than me. So he was diagnosed, he's 24 now. He was diagnosed at 23 months of age. So over 2 decades ago. And I was 12 at the time. So autism, I actually was an only child for 10 years. He was born and then autism came into our world. So I got that lived experience in terms of being a sibling. And one of the reasons that I focus on the whole family so much is because I saw the ways in which my parents were not supported through this journey. And in turn, then it was hard to support me in navigating this. So I think that's part of it, is like understanding, some of the hardships and the things that families are navigating. I really, truly do understand that. And then I think the other side of it is, what I've done a lot of like personal work myself. I work with a therapist who really helps me tune in to like being my authentic self. And by nature, I think being in our helping fields, I am like a helper and fixer. And I love being able to do that. But I've also learned that being more vulnerable, being myself, helps other people to do that. And so I talk with families a lot about, I want you to model for your kids what you want them to do. It feels like this like contradiction if I'm telling them to do it, but then I'm not also doing it as well. And I think by being myself, sharing even some of my emotions that come up and all of that, it gives other people permission. I think there's a lot of stigma around mental health. And I think the more that we can have these conversations and that people can feel like it's okay to be themselves, the further we get in this work. And so that's one of the biggest reasons that I like intentionally have chosen to show up on social media, on my podcast, as a human first, because I want parents to do that as well.
Gems all over, gems all over. So really, not just that authenticity that you show to the parents, but you're modeling them being authentic towards and being vulnerable towards their own kids too. And it's funny you mentioned that. I didn't even realize how much that was a thing until you just started to say this. Like when the kids come to see me, right? Kids with autism, they're scared, they may be overwhelmed, with being in a doctor's office, whatever. And I'm trying, because I'm always looking into every child's airway, because I want to see, do they have big tonsils? Do we need a sleep study? Whatever. And one thing I always do, especially for the child who's like, no, and I just tell the mom, I'm like, okay, mom, open your mouth. And we all go, okay, doctor's opening their mouth. And the kid is like, and they really feed off of that. And I think that is just so, so powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. I think modeling is one of our most powerful tools that we often forget about. And I think this is true of all children, but also even adults, right? Like, and you probably know more about this than I do, but from a brain level, like neurobiology, like literally our brains are wired to mirror other people. And so I think that's some of it is we have to remember what feels natural. But I think sometimes too, especially with autistic kids, especially when they have spoken language themselves, our go-to is to try to explain all of this. But sometimes language is complicated. It's overwhelming and it doesn't help someone picture what actually needs to be done. And our nonverbal communication in all of this is just so incredibly powerful. And so I think something that as a whole, we can do more and more of.
That is so good. So let's jump right in. Like we're not in already, we're in, but let's just move to the next level. What is PDA?
Yeah. So this is something, if you haven't heard of it, it's called pathological demand avoidance. That is not the preferred name by the autistic community. They usually prefer persistent or pervasive drive for autonomy. And I think there's a lot of conversation going on right now about PDA and like what it is. And it's popping up everywhere on social media. And I think it's great. It's creating conversation. I think that's the thing with social media is it creates conversations. Again, it reduces some of that stigma. And I find a lot of parents that come to me are like, oh my gosh, this is finally making sense. It ends up being an entry point into getting their child more support. And so I love social media in that way. But I also think that, really figuring out does this fit your child or not takes more complex work. So PDA right now is a theorized profile of autism, and theorized because we don't have a lot of research on it. But ultimately it's when your child's body, or an adult this can happen for as well, but when your child's body goes into a fight or flight response, in response to demands or a perceived loss of autonomy. So what I like to think about it as is this nervous system activation that happens because of everyday situations. It's a misfiring of the nervous system. And it can be that fight flight response, like really big behaviors, defiance, all of that. It appears a defiance, but it truly is they can't regulate themselves enough to be able to follow through. But it also can look like this freeze fawn response as well, where it's kind of like freezing or overly complying, but then that dysregulates them later. So a lot of times we'll hear at school, they're an angel, but then they come home and they're having these massive meltdowns. And so ultimately, I think what it does is it ends up being an entry point for a lot of families. They learn about PDA. And for those kids that don't already have an autism diagnosis, they could have this high masking profile, really subtle presentations. And it's the first piece in the puzzle that parents start to go oh, this describes my child, but wait, it's associated with autism. It's known as a profile of autism. At least right now it is. It might expand. We might say it's related to ADHD and other things in the future as more research evolves. But it makes them, at least in my practice, call me and say, hey, I think I need an evaluation done for autism. And I find that to be a really helpful approach. I also find it is helpful in conceptualizing some of these big emotions and big feelings as through the lens of this nervous system activation, that these children aren't trying to be defiant. They're not trying to be willful. They truly are having a hard time and they need support in regulating through that.
So in terms of that really around that self-regulation and supporting them appropriately. Say, for instance, because this is something scenarios I see and experience with a lot of families as well. Big emotions, big meltdowns, everybody's overwhelmed. What are just some practical ways to kind of take down the level a few notches, and how can families support their child through that process?
Yeah. I mean, I always think of two ways of this, and I'll touch on both briefly. We have the reactive approaches and the proactive approaches. And our brains often go to like, when these meltdowns are happening, what
Yeah.
do we do in the moment?
Mm,
And this is often counterintuitive. A lot of times we want to try to work through it. We want to try to fix it. We want to try to solve it. The best things in the moment that you can do is allowing your child to work through that emotion, holding space for them, and allowing them to kind of get up over the hill. And for some kids, that is, trying some verbal like soothing strategies of like, I'm here with you right now. I know this feels really hard. How can I help you? Asking questions. For other
mm,
kids, that's super activating for them. And it's simply just like being with them. But I think one of the biggest misconceptions in this is, as parents, it's so easy to want to fix the problem,
mhm,
right? But what these kids really need is you to have a calm, regulated nervous system so that they can co-regulate with you. That's hard, right? Getting yourself regulated in these moments,
mhm,
for sure. And sometimes it's working with parents of like, what do you need in this moment to calm your nervous system down so that they can lean on your nervous system for
mhm,
regulation. But as a whole, these reactive strategies, I like to think about less is more here, not
mhm,
trying to do everything in that moment. Some of the proactive strategies, I mean, there's a bunch of different things, but one of the things that I would think about is how can we give a sense of choice and autonomy in this? How can we give a little bit more sense of control?
mhm,
And so this can look like, for example, if you notice like your child, their body goes into this fight flight reaction when you're saying, hey, go brush your teeth. I need you to do your homework. Sometimes it's reframing the language. It's called declarative language of like, I wonder how long it would take your homework to get done, or I set your toothbrush out when you're ready.
mhm,
So it's rather than directly telling them what to do, it's giving them some autonomy in making that decision. But it's also sometimes as parents, sometimes we can use these strategies, but we have this really heavy expectation that they're still going to comply. And I think
mhm,
some of it is working through a mindset shift for yourself as a parent. Like, what does it mean if they don't do it right then? And what we don't realize is sometimes as in this parenting journey, there can be a lot of shoulds attached to it. Well, they should be able to brush their teeth. And if they don't, I'm a bad parent if they don't brush their
mhm,
teeth. And so it's working through some of these mindset shifts as well, which also then in turn will help you stay more regulated in that moment too.
mhm, that is so helpful. Now let's take it to sleep, right? Because
Yeah,
that's where we always end up.
totally.
So I love that idea of what you said about the toothbrush, because for some reason, teeth brushing and kids, it's just a thing, right? So sometimes these are times when, for instance, just that like sensory overload and overstimulation really makes bedtime just awful. Like it's
Mhm.
plain awful. Parents are dreading it as 6 o'clock approaches, they're like already having palpitations about what they're going to expect tonight. So, in terms of working alongside the child, what are just some strategies you teach parents? Because um a lot of these children, anywhere from 40 to 80% of kids with autism have sleep issues, and many times it's a combination of difficulties falling asleep. Sometimes it's difficulty with sleep maintenance, and a lot of times it's just a battle around that routine, around getting them to get to move forward so that they can head in the direction of the bedroom. So how do you tend to get this? I mean, I feel like it applies to everything else: wearing a hat in the winter, wearing their wearing a coat, whatever. But what are some tools you provide parents with along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few elements that I think about is that sensory experience, right? Of like, how can we provide some accommodations for that sensory experience? For example, like, are they wearing a certain kind of pajamas? And like every time they put on their pajamas, like, can we identify some patterns? Maybe it's something like the tags in the pajamas are the things that are sending their nervous system into this overdrive mode. And usually it's no one thing, it's this cumulative effect, but like these little things can have a huge impact. So, what are some of the ways that we're supporting the sensory systems in terms of those sensory sensitivities? Can I have a lot of kids that wear like bamboo pajamas because that's what feels best on their skin, or using like within reason, and like monitoring this, but weighted blankets or compression sleeves to get that tight feeling. But also, like, can we get the proprioceptive big body movement before bed in order to help them down regulate and then move into a calming activity? So I like to think about some of those sensory system elements. I also like to think about transitions and demands can be really hard. So bedtime tends to be full of a lot of transitions and also a lot of demands that come with this. And so if our primary thing is sleep, which is important, which is a non-negotiable, there might be some other things as a strategy we actually let go. So maybe toothbrushing is the thing that's sending them over every single night. You know what? Maybe it's we brush teeth in the morning and not as we're trying to wind down. Or maybe we brush teeth in the middle of the day, for example, right? Like, sure, if a dentist was on here, they'd be like, but no, you need to brush at night. Yes, that's the goal long term, but we might need to scaffold up to that and help them build some other elements and some coping strategies and self-regulation before we're going to be able to get there. And you know very well this vicious cycle of if you're not sleeping, you're more dysregulated, right? So you have less capacity. And so if we focus the emphasis on how can we get them to go to sleep, it also might help them feel more regulated for some of these other things leading up to bedtime. And then how do we support these transitions too? Can we reduce the number of transitions, for example? Or can we give some sense of control and autonomy of like, hey, what do you want to do first? Something sometimes, especially for these kids with this theorized PDA profile, like them telling the parent what the bedtime routine is, sometimes that can be regulating enough because they feel like they have a sense of control. And it's really perceived autonomy. It's not that they're fully autonomous, but like, how can we give them that perception that they do have a sense of control, which then in turn, and this is really important, creates a sense of safety. And I mean like physiological, like psychological, emotional safety, not like physical safety here. And that can be helpful too.
You just like freed so many parents by saying that, honestly. You have no idea, because teeth brushing is a thing.
Yeah. It really is. It's so many sensory experiences. You usually have taste, you have the bristles, you have something moving around your mouth in unfamiliar ways. You have the foaming. I mean, there's so many elements of, it's such an intense sensory experience.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you guys, if you're watching this live or you're going to watch it on the replay, just kind of walk through the steps. Like, there are things that can be simplified. There are things that can be consolidated. There are things that can be stacked, almost like you said, like scaffolding. And, just paying attention. Are there certain things that are triggering? Is it the jammies, right? You're right. If it's fleece or feels kind of weird, that might just take them off, right? So I think that is just so powerful. So it's not just about sleep hygiene and keeping everywhere dark and doing, sometimes it's in the little steps that you'll notice that, okay, things are awry, and making those adjustments to improve it. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
Now I have one last question. Okay, this journey of having a child that has autism is, like you said, like your experience, right? It can be pretty stressful upon families, impact quality of life, and sometimes it can feel lonely. So now, just what tools, and I'm going to have you talk about your programs as well and the work you do, but what tools can families even harness in that sense so that they can thrive and so that their children can thrive, like, related to schools, related to where they should seek therapy? Like, how do they even, I know it's a big loaded question.
Yeah. Well, My mind goes to two things that are fully within their power, their control right away, that don't require any additional, like, oh, I got to go seek out this service. So the first one is trusting your gut instinct in this. I find that that is so incredibly powerful. The very, very large majority of times that parents are like coming to me, like a lot of parents have trouble even sometimes getting access to the diagnosis process because they're being told like, no, I don't see that. Or, like, oh, let's wait and see, or that's not a concern right now. Or they're waiting on like infinite wait lists. But I think trusting your gut in this, I really have found that to be such a huge piece in this. And just remembering you are the expert of your child. And I know before we hit like to go live here, we were talking about that. I think sometimes with working with professionals, there's this natural hierarchy that some professionals also assert, but then also is assumed that it's like, oh, they know better than you. No one knows as good as you do in terms of your child. Even if I work with your family in a clinical sense, I am not the expert of your child, and I never will be. And I think it's important that parents recognize that they are. So I think listening to like their gut on this and how to navigate and what feels right, even if you have a provider telling you you need to do all this therapy, if that feels overwhelming and you're thinking about the cascading effect on your family, listen to that. It is okay to say, hey, we're not going to do that right now. Let's try it this way. You can always make a different decision, right? If you try something and it doesn't work and you're like, we really should have done speech therapy. It's not too late. Then you go through that process, but maybe in that moment, it didn't work with your schedule because you had to run your other kid to soccer, right? Like those are real important factors to consider in this. And only you are going to know the ecosystem of your family. And so trusting your gut in that. I think that's point number one. Point number two that I also think is not often brought up in the diagnosis process is, how are you feeling about this diagnosis? How can we create space for your emotions? You are human first and foremost. So of course you're going to have emotions, and emotions aren't simple. They're very, very complex. So I have families, when I give a diagnosis, I always stop and pause. I'm like, I'll say your child is autistic, your child's meeting diagnostic criteria for this. What's that like to have that confirmed? And I will say a lot of families end up telling me relief because it's been such a long journey. But then they'll also say, I feel frustrated, or I'm angry that it's taken this long, or I feel really sad, or, I really was hoping you were going to tell me it wasn't autism today, even though I knew it was autism. There's so many complex emotions, and those can coexist. But I think it's important to also recognize it is very, very common to go through the cycle of grief in response to this diagnosis. And I want to be loud and clear. You are not grieving your child. You are grieving the shift in expectations. You are grieving your child having to navigate sometimes not the most accepting world, although it's gotten better. It still is hard. Our world is not set up for neurodivergent individuals all the time. And so there is this grief process that often comes with this. And some people move through it really quickly. Some people think they've moved through it quickly, but are just pushing down their emotions and hopping into action. And some, it's this iterative process. And I think what's also important to remember is for everyone, it's not a one and done thing. There can be other points in this journey where you're also going through some of these complex emotions.
All of that. That is just incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, we've talked about a lot of things, right? We've talked about PDA. We've talked about just that sensory overload and really being sort of modeling what we want to see. We've talked about holding space when you're getting that news. Now, tell us where people can find you, and tell us a little bit, maybe start with just some of the work you do within this space, because I think you're a unicorn pretty much.
Thank you. Thanks. I like because I went through this with my family. I like being able to fill the gaps in ways that I feel like families are unsupported, and really help to shift perspectives on autism, helping families understand what autism is more accurately than what they just go to Google for, but also realizing we can approach your autistic child like a human first in all of this, which is the definition of neurodiversity affirming care, is really understanding your child's strengths and your child's support needs in this. And so that's always something that's so important. So I've developed my practice. So as a psychologist, I'm based in Pennsylvania currently, but I can practice in, I believe it's 40 states. And that's because psychology has a compact that allows me to do telehealth services across the country. And so I do diagnostic evaluation. I see kids currently ages 1 to 12, although I am in the process of hiring another psychologist and hoping even to expand that age range. I do diagnostic evaluations and then therapeutic support services. So my primary therapy modality right now is group therapy. So it's all parents of autistic kids and it's a rolling basis. So you can kind of come in, get the support, but within this context of group, you get that individualized support. So you can show up to the call and say, okay, here's what Bobby's struggling with today. Can you help me troubleshoot this? Or, we're really stuck here. What do we do? Or we're trying to make decisions about services. We don't know where to go. How do I look for a provider? Or how do I advocate for an IEP? Or even hey, we've been thinking about medication. What are your thoughts on that? And I'm not a prescribing provider, but I'll talk about when to consider medication, when you should be, what different options are. So you can go in to have that conversation with the prescribing provider informed about, some of this. And and I love to do care coordination. So I'll hop on a call with a pediatrician and be like, hey, I just talked with Susie's parents and this is what I'm seeing. Here's what I've seen work for other kids. And they'll be like, oh yeah, I like that medication. I'm going to try this, and doing that collaboration with a speech therapist to make sure we're aligned in terms of goals. So it's a really holistic approach, but then also you get unlimited support, which I think most families are pretty shocked by. If you're on the one-to-one individual services side, you have the ability to be able to text me, whether that's through the evaluation process, to share videos of your child, to say, hey, I also noticed this. Or on the group therapy side, it's a group chat that I'm in daily and families are asking questions, sharing wins, sharing hardships and getting kind of that comprehensive care support.
That's amazing. So if people do want to work with you, where do they go? Where can they find you and all?
Yeah. So my website is drtaylorday.com. And like I said, you can, see a little bit about my services. We're in the process of building the website out even more. And if I'm in one of the states, that you live in, we can do clinical services. I also, this isn't officially announced yet, but will be very soon. I am developing a membership model as well that will be more educational. So I love providing free education on my Instagram, which is just the Dr. Tay, DR, but it has periods in between. So the period, DR period. Oh, look at that. Ooh, this is so cool. I love the little stream thing. So there we go. There's my Instagram. And then my podcast is Evolve with Dr. Tay. So love being able to provide free education. But the purpose of the membership is to be able to help bring all these pieces together. It's a lot to navigate. And my goal of the membership is instead of you going to Google, you get to come to a place where you can get reputable information, but also at the same time, know what you can start working on at home and how to find providers that are going to support you. So all of that information will be on the website.
Woohoo, that's awesome. So we're going to be on the lookout, but you guys definitely check out the IG is the Dr. Tay with the periods, and we'll put that in the notes as well. This has been incredible. This has been amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. Any final words before we close out?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, my dog, it's dinner time, so she is letting me know. So I apologize for the barking in the background. But, I think ultimately is just realizing that you can support your child for who they are. And I think there's so many amazing resources. And so trusting your instinct in this and navigating this as a family. And while it is going to come with hard moments, there also can be so many beautiful moments that you can really work through to support your child, and just seeing your child for who they are. They were born this way. If they are autistic, their brain is wired this way. They've always been like this. And so helping them to figure out how to navigate this world, I think, is the best thing you can do. And there's so many amazing resources out there.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I think one thing you keep saying again and again is around the fact that children and families with autism can thrive. It's not either or. You can have a child who has autism and you can thrive. So this has really been awesome. Thank you so much. It went even much better than I anticipated. I knew it was going to be really cool. This is definitely one you guys want to watch again. You want to share with communities. You want to share with families of kids that you know would benefit from this. And if you're out there and you are looking for services and you want to learn more about Dr. Tay's services, check out her website. I mean, 40 states. That is incredible. I mean, you're covering the entire US pretty much. That's awesome.
Yeah.
You know? And we here at the Restful Sleep Place, we're licensed in 3 states. We're making our way up. But if you do have a child or you're a parent who's struggling with sleep issues, we're licensed in Pennsylvania, in California, and New Jersey. We would love to walk that journey with you. So feel free to schedule an appointment with us. It's therestfulsleepplace.com. And really, let's get this show on the road. So thank you again. And for y'all out there, it's been awesome. And until next time, I hope you rest well.
Bye. Thank you.